Hello and welcome. I am Thomas Porteous and you are watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top global stories. US President Donald Trump warns that nobody is getting off the hook for unfair trade balances, with the United States hinting at more tariffs ahead. This comes a day after the White House exempted smartphones and computers from import taxes on China. After a Russian missile strike on Ukraine, Sumy killed 34 and injured 117, Western allies slammed Moscow. The United States called it horrifying, while Germany's Chancellor-in-Waiting accused Russia of a war crime. Malaysian Prime Minister Ibrahim says he will meet the head of Myanmar's junta in Bangkok this week. The talks are to push a ceasefire between the military government and rebel groups, along with the support of earthquake relief groups. China's President Xi Jinping begins his Southeast Asia tour in Vietnam amid trade tensions with Trump. Xi called for stronger industrial and supply chain partnerships. The trial of impeached South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol starts his first criminal hearing over insurrection charges in Seoul. This follows his December 3rd decree imposing martial law. Pop star Katy Perry and 5 other women are set to blast into space aboard Jeff Bezos' space tourism rocket. The West Texas launch will last around 11 minutes and is the first all-women space flight since 1963. Cambodia deports an unknown number of Taiwanese citizens to China after they were arrested in telecom fraud centres. The move comes ahead of Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to the Southeast Asian country later this week. Iran's foreign minister is set to visit Moscow to discuss recent nuclear negotiations with the United States with Tehran. Russia has been an outspoken supporter of the United States easing sanctions on Iran. Let's start in the Indo-Pacific, where South Korea's acting president, Han Duck-soo, has said that US President Donald Trump apparently his administration to conduct immediate tariff negotiations with South Korea, Japan and India. Han said that he had explained South Korea's position on the tariff matter in detail to Trump and that the US leader had been satisfied with Seoul's stance. Speaking at a meeting of the Economic Security Strategy Task Force, Han said that he would be willing to talk directly with Trump again if needed to advance cooperation in key areas like liquefied natural gas and shipbuilding. He also says he expects a video conference within a day or two to discuss cooperation on a major liquefied natural gas project in Alaska. The project, involving a pipeline from Alaska's North Slope to the south, aims to boost US energy exports to Asia. Last week, South Korea's trade minister said cooperation in shipbuilding could be a strong bargaining chip in upcoming tariff negotiations. Meanwhile, South Korea's first vice foreign minister, Kim Hong-hyun, told Parliament that the Trump administration has not yet proposed talks on defense for stationed US troops, but he said Seoul is preparing for a range of possible scenarios. Trump said that he spoke to Han about South Korea's payments for what he called big-time US military protection, a signal that defense costs could be tied into a broader deal that includes trade and tariffs. In a major diplomatic outreach, Chinese President Xi Jinping has arrived in Vietnam, marking the start of a 3-nation Southeast Asia tour. His visit comes at the time of a rising global trade tensions, especially with the United States. In a strong message aimed at Washington, Xi warned that protectionism leads nowhere and warns that trade wars have no winners, which is a clear swipe at US tariffs under President Donald Trump. Xi is calling for stronger trade and supply chain cooperation with Vietnam, even as both countries navigate pressure from US duties. He's also urging deeper collaboration in green technology and artificial intelligence. The Chinese leader emphasized that China and Vietnam should resolve maritime disputes through dialogue and negotiation amid long-standing tensions in the South China Sea. Xi has also said he's looking forward in-depth strategic discussions with Vietnamese leaders on bilateral ties and broader regional issues. From Vietnam, Xi will travel to Malaysia and Cambodia. We are joined by Joshua Barnes, anchor correspondent to discuss this further. Joshua, what can you tell me about this important meeting between the premiers of Vietnam and Chinese President Xi Jinping?
Yes, well, this meeting is extremely important in President Xi's mind. He is looking at a situation where the country is currently being hit by US tariffs that we know, of course, are up at 145% for many goods. Now, Xi's plan with these meetings is to visit 3 countries, 3 trading partners with China in Southeast Asia, and try and build ties with those nations in the face of this difficulty with the United States. Now, heading to Vietnam first. Vietnam is a major trading partner with China. To give you some context on how much trade goes on, Vietnam, of course, produces a lot of chips. They have TSMC, the world's largest semiconductor producer, and they provide around $31 billion worth of exports to the United States. In contrast, Vietnam brings in $30 billion worth of goods from China. So that provides you an insight into how significant these 2 countries are. Now, this meeting for Xi is vital in building those trade negotiations and building those trade partners, but it also could be seen as a diplomatic move to call out against US President Donald Trump's actions. Let's not forget, Vietnam were set to be hit with 46% tariffs until that was reduced to 10% for 90 days. So Vietnam in a difficult point. Hanoi obviously looking at reducing that 46%. Negotiations have already got underway with the United States. But for President Xi, this is a show of unity with the wider region. He then heads to Malaysia and Cambodia. He hasn't visited those places for a decade. So this really is a big move from Xi, a big move of solidarity for the Southeast Asian region, and a move against the US tariffs.
Joshua Barnes, thank you very much for joining us. You are staying with us. China on Monday revealed a jump in its exports and fall in its imports for Q1 of this year, and said that it is looking to diversify its market and look for other partner countries as it grapples with an ongoing trade war with the United States. This is after factories rushed out shipments before the latest US tariffs took effect, but an escalating Sino-US trade war has darkened the outlook for factories and growth in the world's second biggest economy. Meanwhile, despite US Donald Trump suggesting that the exemptions could be short-lived, European stocks rallied around 2% at the start of the week, tracking gains in Asia as well as on Wall Street. Frankfurt jumped 2.3% in early deals. Paris gained 2.2% and London advanced 1.9%. This comes after Trump announced that he will unveil new tariff rates on imported semiconductors within the next week. Speaking aboard Air Force One, Trump made it clear that no country will be getting off the hook on tariffs, signaling a tougher stance ahead. Meanwhile, China retaliates by halting exports of key rare earth minerals and magnets, which are very critical to the global electronics, auto and defense industries. These materials, now subject to tight exports controls, could choke supply chains for American tech and military firms. Trump says the US has a $1 trillion trade deficit with China, accusing Beijing of taking hundreds of billions a year and warning that there will be no deal unless the surplus is resolved. Let's turn to the Middle East now, where Yemen's Houthi rebels say they have fired 2 ballistic missiles at Israel, targeting a military base and an airport. The group claimed one missile was aimed at the Sdot Mika base near Ashdod and the other at Ben Gurion International Airport near Tel Aviv. Israeli forces confirmed that a missile was launched from Yemen and said it was successfully intercepted. Air raid sirens were heard across Israel, including in Jerusalem, but no damage or injuries have been reported. The Houthis say they have been launching missiles and drones towards Israel since the war in Gaza began last October, saying they are acting in support of Palestinians. Attacks temporarily stopped during a ceasefire in January, but resumed after Israel restarted its offensive in March. Let's listen in to what Houthi military spokesman Yahya Sari's comment.
غزة نفذت القوة الصاروخية في القوات المسلحة اليمنية عملية عسكرية نوعية، وذلك بصاروخين باليستيين أحدهما فرط صوتي نوع فلسطين 2 استهدف قاعدة سودة ميخا في منطقة شرق أسدود المحتلة، وهي قاعدة صاروخية لإطلاق صواريخ أريحة وبطاريات صواريخ حيتس. والصاروخ الآخر نوع ذي الفقار استهدف مطار بن غوريون في منطقة يافا المحتلة.
Meanwhile, the Houthi rebels say that an American airstrike has killed 7 people and injured more than a dozen others. The strike hit a factory in Sana'a province. Houthi media says the total number of victims has risen to 20, with 7 dead and 13 wounded. The US also carried out strikes in other parts of Yemen, including Sada and Hodeida provinces. America started targeting the Houthi areas in March after the rebels began attacking ships in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. The conflict has disrupted shipping in one of the world's most important trade routes, forcing many vessels to take longer, more expensive detours. We are once again joined by Joshua Barnes, anchoring correspondent for NewsX World, to discuss this further. Joshua, what are the updates you can give on this ongoing situation between Houthi rebels and the United States?
Yes, Tom, absolutely. Well, these strikes have been near daily from the United States. Of course, we know that action started on the 15th of March when attacks targeting specific Houthi targets were launched in a sort of response to attacks, as you've mentioned already, on Red Sea shipping and the Gulf of Aden. Now, this situation has arisen from the situation with Israel and Palestinians in Gaza. The Yemen say that they have started these strikes once again in solidarity with Palestinians after Israel resumed attacks following the lack of hostage releases. Now, the situation here in Yemen is slightly different. Now, these military strikes from the US are precise, and the casualty numbers that we're seeing are a lot lower than strikes in the region elsewhere, but there is of course civilian death, and we've seen that today. Now, we must say that these are reported strikes. The Yemen Houthi-run authorities have said that these strikes have happened. The US have not yet confirmed it, but it's just a continuation of action we've been seeing. You mentioned the impact there. Of course, the Red Sea is a key trade route, and amid the global trade tensions, this is furthering issues of goods transfer. So for the US, it's vital to get this stopped, and they have, of course, got warships in the region sort of countering these attacks that the Houthi Yemen rebels have been launching. But it's a continuating situation that doesn't seem to have an end date yet, given the fact that the Houthis are continuing their assaults and the US, of course, are following suit.
Joshua Barnes, thank you very much for joining us. Let's now turn our attention to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where a Russian drone attack on Odessa injured 8 people and damaged homes, a medical facility and a warehouse, according to regional officials. In Zaporozhye, overnight strikes caused a fire at a petrol station. The assaults followed a deadly missile strike in Sumy, where 34 were killed and 117 were injured in the deadliest attack in Ukraine so far this year. Meanwhile, Polish Foreign Minister Radoslaw Sikorski condemned Russia's missile strike on Sumy, calling it a blatant mockery of Ukraine's ceasefire proposal and a dismissal of US diplomatic efforts. Speaking at a EU summit, Sikorski urged President Trump and his administration to recognize Putin's actions as hostile and to respond with appropriate and decisive measures. Here's what he said.
We're going to discuss, but right now I think we have to put the pressure, the maximum pressure on Russia to really end this war, because it takes two to want peace. It only takes one to want war, and we see that Russia really wants war. And all those who want the killing to stop should put the maximum pressure on Russia. Thank you.
Meanwhile, EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas urged for maximum pressure on Russia to end its war in Ukraine following a missile strike on the Sumy region. She stressed that peace requires effort from both sides. Here's what EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas had to say.
Of course, we're going to discuss, but right now I think we have to put the pressure, the maximum pressure on Russia to really end this war, because it takes two to want peace. It only takes one to want war, and we see that Russia really wants war. And all those who want the killing to stop should put the maximum pressure on Russia. Thank you.
Moving on now, the European Union is stepping up its support for the Palestinian Authority with a major $1.8 billion package over 3 years aimed at financial aid and key reforms. The move comes as EU officials eye the Palestinian Authority as a potential governing force in Gaza post-conflict. Meanwhile, a significant diplomatic rift. The Palestinian Foreign Ministry has slammed Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's criticism of French President Emmanuel Macron's push to recognise a Palestinian state, calling it an unjustified attack and a rejection of peace efforts. On the hostage front, fresh hopes emerge as, according to reports, Hamas may now be willing to release more hostages under a new truce deal, with US pressure mounting for an agreement by this month's end. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has confirmed that talks are focused on the release of 10 hostages in the current phase. A Hamas delegation is expected in Cairo soon for key negotiations with Egypt and Qatar. We stay in the Middle East, where Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi is set to travel to Moscow to engage in discussions concerning the recent nuclear negotiations between the United States and Iran, which took place in Oman. The Foreign Ministry spokesperson confirmed the visit, stating that it was pre-planned and would serve as an important opportunity to assess the latest developments emerging from the Muscat talks. At the same time, European powers will be cautious about these negotiations. French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot emphasised that France, along with Britain and Germany, will closely monitor any discussions between the US and Iran to ensure that they align with European security interests, particularly in relation to Iran's nuclear programme. Barrot's comments were made as he arrived in Luxembourg for an EU foreign ministers meeting, highlighting the ongoing international concern over the nuclear talks. We move to the Indo-Pacific now, where Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim announced that he will meet Myanmar's junta leader Min Aung Hlaing this week in Bangkok. The meeting, set for Thursday, comes as Myanmar's military chief makes a rare trip abroad to discuss earthquake relief efforts. Anwar, who holds the rotating chairmanship of ASEAN, emphasised that the focus of the meeting would be to ensure the safety of Malaysian aid workers in Myanmar following the devastating earthquake on March the 28th that killed over 3,600 people and left millions in need of assistance. While the ASEAN bloc has barred Myanmar's junta leaders from participating in regional summits following the 2021 coup that ousted Aung San Suu Kyi, Anwar's talks with Min Aung will be conducted in a bid to extend a ceasefire that was announced after the earthquake. Anwar hopes to secure an extension beyond the April 22 expiration as ongoing humanitarian efforts continue in the disaster zone. Mario Vargas Llosa, the legendary Peruvian novelist and winner of the 2010 Nobel Prize in Literature, has died at the age of 89. A central figure in the Latin American literacy boom, his works explored the deeper struggles of power, violence, and political turmoil that shaped the region. Through novels like Time of a Hero, which challenged military corruption, and Conversations in the Cathedral, which exposed dictatorship in Peru, Vargas Llosa became a defining voice in the continent's literacy movement. His political journey saw him shift from left-wing ideologies, growing disillusioned with them, and then running unsuccessfully for presidency in Peru of 1990. He was a controversial and compelling figure, both in literature and politics. Vargas Llosa passed away on April the 13th in Lima, leaving a lasting legacy behind. We move to Europe now, where Spain's Coast Guard rescued on Sunday 50 migrants trying to reach the Canary Islands on an inflatable boat. According to the Spanish Red Cross, the migrants, which included 45 men, 4 women and 1 minor, were taken to El Rosario port in Fuerteventura Island in the Coast Guard vessel due to heavy rains in the past few days. The boat was located 144 kilometers off the island of Lanzarote. Reportedly, the Canarian arpeggio is still struggling to absorb an all-time migration peak from 2024, although irregular migration has slowed down by 28% this year. The Atlantic route is especially dangerous, as the ocean's rough weather can easily capsize the fragile rafts and dinghies used by most migrants. Well, that's all we have time for. We will continue to bring you more news updates from around the world.